right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Truman Library Institute's webinar series, The First 5 Days, honoring the 75th anniversary of the presidency of Harry S. Truman. Today, we're joined by Dr. Kurt Graham, Director of the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum, who will be taking us through the historic events of April 12th, 1945. Dr. Graham, thank you for joining us.
Good to be here. Thank you.
At the conclusion of Dr. Graham's 15-minute presentation, there will be a 10 to 15-minute Q&A session. Questions can be submitted during and immediately following his remarks via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Now, it is my pleasure to turn the microphone over to Dr. Graham.
Well, thank you, Morgan, and thank you everyone at the Institute for setting this up. This is a unique opportunity for us to get to share with you some really important history, some really important days in history. We would have loved to have done this in a large public gathering, but being limited to 10 people, we thought that would get in the way of things a bit. So we're very pleased to be able to share this with you. And my task today is to walk you through the events of April 12th, 1945, and then a little bit into the following day, Harry Truman's first full day in office as president. So skipping into the first slide, I believe, is a shot of Truman's vice presidential office. And I wanted to start out just talking a little bit about the vice presidency and Truman's ascension to that office, which was a post he did not necessarily want to have. Truman always felt that those who had come into the presidency through what he called the back door were not necessarily treated very kindly by history. And he felt that there was a very good chance he would become president in this way. Everybody knew that Roosevelt was ill. Everybody knew that it was going to be, he probably would not survive that fourth term. So in the summer of 44, he was put forward as a candidate because the party did not want to have Vice President Wallace continue in that role because they didn't want to risk him becoming president. The irony is Truman went to the convention fully intending to nominate someone else. He had a friend that was sort of interested in the job and up for the job, and he said to him, "I'm going to go and I'm going to make a speech on your behalf and I'm going to put your name in nomination." Well, it didn't work out that way. Truman was kind of strong-armed into taking that position, which I think he realized for the party and for the country that he needed to do that. So he did. He stepped forward and went through the election process. Obviously, Roosevelt won an unprecedented fourth term. And a couple months after that, they were sworn into office. And then just 82 days later, Truman ascends to the presidency. Again, no one was surprised that Truman was going to become president, but I think everyone was shocked that Roosevelt was that sick. And Roosevelt was in sort of denial. He knew he was not well, but I don't think anybody realized that it would happen this quickly. So Truman is in this role of vice president. He's only met with Roosevelt twice privately, other than a couple of other cabinet meetings and whatnot. But the role that Truman did appreciate about being vice president was, as you know, the only constitutional responsibility that the vice president has is to preside over the Senate, which is what Truman was doing on the morning of April 12th, 1945. And while he's sitting at the dais listening to, and we have a letter that shows that Truman was writing to his mother and his sister back home. And I think that's, if we could advance the slide, I think that's the next image that we have. And this is a letter that he writes to his mother and sister, and he says he's presiding over the Senate, and while a windy senator from Wisconsin is making a speech on a subject with which he is in no way familiar. So Truman had the task of sitting through a lot of debate that he didn't necessarily care for, but it gave him a moment to dash a note home. And the subject of the letter was he was very excited about the fact that he was working on a Jefferson Day speech. Jefferson's birthday is the following day, April 13th. And it was kind of a Democratic Party event, tradition, to have a Jefferson-Jackson Day dinner. So the Jefferson Day dinner was to be the next day. And he and FDR were both working on their speeches that day. And he writes in this letter to his mother, turn on the radio tomorrow night and you'll hear Harry make a speech to the nation. And, you know, again, he's only been vice president 82 days. He was a relatively obscure senator prior to this in terms of national prominence or national attention. So he's thinking it's kind of a big deal, kind of a neat opportunity to get to write this or give this speech on the radio. And the final phrase in that speech, he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, the next voice you hear will be that of the President of the United States." And he was going to hand off to Franklin Roosevelt, and Roosevelt was going to give his Jefferson Day speech, which he had also worked on. But of course, that was not to be, because that afternoon at about 3:30 down in Warm Springs, Georgia, where President Roosevelt was at his retreat, a place he had gone to year after year. He had polio, as you know, and he had sort of seen Warm Springs as a place that could help people who were in his condition. So it was something he poured a lot of effort and energy and time and his own personal resources into. But he went down there for a much needed rest and had a massive cerebral hemorrhage and died of a stroke very, very shortly thereafter. He didn't regain consciousness from the time he complained of his piercing headache. So Truman finished his day. This is at 3:30. He finished his day shortly thereafter. The word had not yet reached Washington, and Truman, after work, went over to his good friend Sam Rayburn's office. Sam Rayburn was the Speaker of the House from Texas, a good friend of Harry Truman's, and they had a little event that they periodically had after work called the Board of Education, which was basically bourbon and branch water in the after hours. And they were sitting there having a drink when the phone rang, and someone at the White House said, you know, Mr. Vice President, come to the White House immediately. They didn't tell him why. He didn't know, even at that moment. He could tell it was serious. He could tell there was a sense of urgency about it. He wrote later that he assumed maybe Roosevelt had come home a little bit early, and there was some event in town that he thought Roosevelt might be interested in. So he thought, well, maybe the president has returned and would like to see me. So he jumps in a car, is escorted to the White House, and taken to the second floor, which is the family's residence in the White House. And upon entering the room, he meets Mrs. Roosevelt, and she said, "Harry, the president is dead." And he said, "Ma'am, is there anything I can do for you?" And she famously said, heard this before, I'm sure, "Harry, the question is there anything we can do for you? For you're the one in trouble now." And I think that is such a telling moment, because I think Harry Truman knew exactly how much trouble he was in. When you look at the pictures, and I don't know if that's the next picture we have in the deck or not, but we have a picture of Truman being sworn in to office. Now, this picture you see right now is outside the White House as people are gathering. The word is beginning to hit the airwaves. They're not there so much to celebrate Truman, obviously, as they are to mourn FDR's passing, a man who'd been president for more than a dozen years now, the only president that many Americans even knew, remembered, and partly because of his innovative radio work and his beautiful lyrical voice and all those things that went with that. But people were gathering outside, milling about, and but Truman, within 2 hours of arriving at the White House, is prepared to take the oath of office. And so we have, I know, a still picture, but I think we also have a moving picture. But of course, we also have a picture of the Bible on which Truman took the oath of office, and you'll see that in the moving clip. It's interesting if you watch closely when that rolls in a minute. Truman very awkwardly goes to kiss the Bible after he has taken the oath, and almost kisses the Supreme Court justice's hand. He barely got it out of the way in time. He extended his hand to shake hands with the new president. This Bible, incidentally, we have had it on display, and we'll have it on display again in the Truman Library. But it is not a Truman family Bible. Truman would have loved to have had his family Bible, which was back in his office, but there was no time to get it. So this came from the head usher's desk drawer, a Gideon Bible that he just happened to have there. And they used it for this purpose. And of course, it became a very important and famous historic artifact at that point. But it is not connected to Truman, other than the fact that this is the Bible on which he took his oath of office the first time. And there you have it. He will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of his ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. Now, we don't have audio and video together of this, but we do have the video of him, the newsreel footage of him taking the oath. You see, he raises his hand to repeat that, and that's the card that you just saw that he's reading from. Look at the expressions on their faces. And you see him, he'll now kiss the Bible. Justice extends his hand, congratulates the new president. And I believe the next slide is a still photo of that same moment. And again, it's worth pausing and realizing that, you know, what these two felt they were up against. First of all, the awkwardness of this moment. You know, Truman, the first time he takes the oath, he's got his hand on the Bible as opposed to raising his hand, as he's supposed to have one hand on the Bible and raising his hand as the justice did. He was holding the Bible in his left hand, put his right hand on top of it. He took the oath again to properly, you know, raise his hand and take that oath in that way. But that little bauble aside, I think the telling story of this photograph is the expression both on Harry Truman's face and especially on Bess Wallace Truman's face. You can't see Margaret, she's right behind the Chief Justice, but there are other angles where this moment was captured, and you see the very somber look on her face as well. Obviously they're grieving, like the whole country is grieving, but it's more than that. I think, honestly, Harry and Bess Truman are scared to death in this moment. And partly because they're following Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. You know, Roosevelt was one of the most beloved figures in the world at this moment. He had been, as I mentioned, president for more than a dozen years. He had a presence, a charisma, a command, a great orator, just a command of language and whatnot that made him just that voice that people relied on. And Eleanor Roosevelt had executed the role of First Lady unlike any First Lady had ever done. She had a daily newspaper column. She traveled extensively. She gave speeches. She did not, you know, serve tea and cookies. And I mean, she probably did some of that as well, but that was not the mainstay of her job as she saw it and as she fulfilled it. Now, Bess, of course, reverts back to, I think, what we would call a much more traditional role, in that she wanted to be out of sight, out of mind, supportive, but not seen in a public way. She didn't see that as her role. And following the Roosevelts had to be one of the scariest things that they ever could have imagined. So Harry Truman, facing the weight of the world on him, you see a quote later, he said very famously, "I felt like the sun and the moon and the stars had fallen on me." He begins to receive notices from around the country from former President, the previous slide, I'm just going blank on the Herbert Hoover, and he gets this indication that, hey, you know, we're all with you, good luck to you, from one president to another. I'm sure that meant a lot to Truman to have something like that come in from someone like Hoover, who knew the pressure of that job and certainly knew what Truman was up against. Truman wrote in the previous slide a note at the bottom of a letter that had been typed up before he found out what happened. But he said, you know, all of this, this is dictated before the world fell in on me. But I've talked to you since, and you know what a blow it was. But I must see it. I must see it through. And you know, I think he just had that sense of duty, that sense of obligation. That's what it was going to take. But it's interesting, as Truman often did in times of great crisis and pressure, he said, I knew that the task was going to be tough. I knew I had a lot to learn. I knew I had a lot to do, and I knew I needed rest. So he went home, went to bed. And that's sort of how he ended that day. And I wanted to say just a few things about, you know, the following day, after Truman has gone through this process of you know, becoming president very unexpectedly and getting a night's rest behind him. He shows up to work earlier than Roosevelt typically rolled out of bed, And this was Thomas Jefferson's birthday. That should not be lost, both for Truman and Roosevelt. They were great students of history, had a great affection for the third president. But Truman shows up to work and he faces this really kind of odd, I'm sure it was a surreal sort of moment for him, because as he comes into the White House, of course, all of Roosevelt's advisors, cabinet people, the sort of people that had surrounded Roosevelt, they're very very different than the Missourians that Truman was going to bring in with him. And I think the clash of those two groups coming together as they began to get to know one another over the coming weeks was a very strange kind of moment. No one really knew who this guy was. They didn't know what to make of him. Was he to keep that cabinet? Would he change everybody out? So it was a very odd moment, I think, for the Roosevelt people to try and size up this Missouri farmer and try and determine whether he was really up to the task at hand. There's a couple of interesting things that Truman does that first day that I think are worth noting quickly. And that is, he sort of broke with tradition. His first day in office, he returned to the Capitol to have lunch with members of the Senate. And that was not the way things were typically done. Typically, senators and congressmen come to the president, not the other way around. But it was interesting that he kicked off his presidency in that way because it really set a tone. Truman, there was a humility about Truman to which I think most elected officials were not accustomed. And to see him willing to come and engage with them, to eat with them, have lunch with them on their terms and their place, and say, hey guys, we're in this together. I think that despite breaking tradition in that way, even members of the opposite party said, that went a long way toward suggesting what kind of a run we were going to have with this guy. And the other thing that I think is very interesting that happened that day after the lunch, he goes back to the White House, and later that afternoon, he meets with a guy named Jimmy Burns. Now, Jimmy Burns is the guy who Truman went to the convention earlier in the summer, having pledged that he would nominate him for vice president. So I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in that meeting and to think what's got to be going through both of these guys' minds. Had Truman's initial plan to nominate Burns and have him be vice president, their roles would have been reversed. That Burns would have been president and Truman would have been, just maybe another senator calling on him to wish him well. But as it was, this guy was being asked to be Secretary of State, and they spoke a little bit about that. But it is just interesting, but for these accidents of history, how close we came to perhaps having a different president altogether. It's very interesting to think over the course of Truman's career, how many times he almost didn't get to the next level. Even starting in Jackson County. I mean, the fact that he ended up in the U.S. Senate at all is really quite incredible and quite unexpected. The fact that he became vice president of the Senate is something he certainly didn't expect. And then the fact that he would land in the highest office in the land as president is incredible. So anyway, that is a little bit of a rundown of those first couple of days, and I'm going to turn to my colleagues. I understand they're perhaps taking some questions or going to offer up some questions, so let me pause for station identification here.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Graham, for a wonderful presentation. To everyone watching, if you have a question and haven't added it to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, go ahead and do so now. You can also like a question that's already been asked if you would like to see it answer. Our first question you actually just answered. Claire asked, who was the person Truman went to the convention to nominate? Oh. So it was Jimmy Burns. And then we have a question asking, I read an account that Bess was sobbing after Harry became president. Why was she so upset?
Well, she was one who was very upset back at that convention that we just mentioned in 44 in the summer. Truman was very suddenly literally physically kind of pushed to the front of this crowd, and you see him go up to the podium and somebody raises his hand kind of in victory, and holds his arm and holds it up. And Truman's got this, oh yeah, this is great. He's got this deer in the headlights, like, what is happening to me? What is going on? And And Bess had a very similar reaction, like, what have you done? What have we done? What is happening to us? I mean, she was just frightened at the whole thing. And so, no, I don't think it's a stretch to say that Bess was less than pleased. And of course, everyone was saddened by the fact that FDR had passed and passed so suddenly. So they were grieving, as everyone was. But I think for them, it was more than that. It was it changed the world, but it changed their lives, and they would never have privacy. They would never have just their own lives back again in the way that they had them before.
All right, we have a popular question that I will ask, and then we'll pivot back to some more about the swearing in and the April 12th. But Mark asks, would President Truman's fair deal have particular relevance today?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mark. It actually does have a lot of relevance. It's, you know, many of the things that Truman called for, you know, people go back and look at the fair deal and say, well, he only got, you know, handful of those things. I mean, he really, I mean, if you look at it as just what did he want, what did he get, most of us would say, well, you know, if I set out to get those kinds of things and didn't get any more than he got, I would consider it maybe a failure. But the reality is Truman paved the way for many things that we're still trying to get, still trying to deal with. And one of the really interesting milestones, stepping stones between Truman's time and our own is the Johnson administration. And Johnson looked back to Truman as he was leaving office. He looked back and he called Harry and Bess and he shared with them that about half of what he felt he had accomplished legislatively in his term as president in the 1960s, he felt initiated or began with Harry Truman. And those are things like Truman called for medical care for all, you know, medical coverage for everyone. He had an aggressive civil rights stance, which was, I mean, this is 1947, 48. I mean, this is unprecedented, you know, that he would make this kind of a call. And of course, Johnson's able to build on that. So much of what Truman established, you know, things like civilian supremacy that wasn't part of the fair deal to answer the question, but I mean, civilian supremacy over the military. I mean, these are hugely important things that Truman did. So the fact that the fair deal did not necessarily all get implemented during Truman's second term, and that has a lot to do with the Korean War, frankly, as why it didn't. But anyway, I think the fair deal is very relevant. I think Truman's call for some of these things remains something that we see presidents on both sides of the aisle grapple with down to our present time.
All right, I think we've got time for two more questions. The next one with the most votes is, to what extent did Truman ever consult Eleanor Roosevelt or seek her counsel after he became president, given Eleanor's tremendous experience and insights into the American people?
Yeah, no, another great question. Eleanor Roosevelt, I think, had a genuine affection for Harry Truman. I think wanted him to succeed. I think saw in him an innate decency. He absolutely thought she was incredible. I mean, he just had nothing but the highest respect for her. He appointed her to be, as you know, the ambassador to the United Nations, which was a big deal. But Eleanor wanted to support Harry Truman, but she also didn't want to upstage him. You know, she didn't want to go somewhere and appear and everybody's there to see Eleanor Roosevelt, not the President of the United States, which early on may likely have been the case. There is some great correspondence, both at the FDR Library and at the Truman Library, some great letters exchanged between Eleanor Roosevelt and Harry Truman. And I think it was just a mutual respect. I really do think very genuine and very sincere. And when he faced some tough decisions, like, for example, the recognition of Israel and what to do with the DP camps and things immediately after the war, even before he got to recognition, he did reach out to her, and she had a lot to say about the Arabs in the Middle East, about oil in the Middle East, about, you know, what would be a wise, prudent approach and what would not be. And I think he paid a lot of attention to her. I think she was a valuable voice in his mind.
Excellent. Okay, we're going to do one more question. I'm sorry, everyone. We've got a lot of questions in here and some really good ones. I apologize that we don't have time for all. But for our last question here, Carla asks, is it unusual that the president and vice president did not meet more often than the two times Truman and Roosevelt met?
Well, it would certainly be unusual today. I mean, today, I think in most administrations, the president and vice president have, at the very least, a standing weekly lunch. I mean, at a minimum. But of course, they are in other meetings, and they. Now, Truman was in cabinet meetings and things during that time, but he only met privately with Roosevelt twice, so he would have seen him. But Roosevelt himself, from the time of the election until his death, was only in Washington. I think it was something like 25 days or something, because he went to Yalta, traveling abroad like that, and he was out of town. Just, he was failing. I mean, he was not in good health. The sad irony is today, of course, that would be taken care of very easily with any number of prescriptions that are advertised in the course of an afternoon television program. But I think that the vice presidency has become a different kind of office in our time. There's an old story, maybe I can end with this, that the famous story they say about the vice president is there was once a woman who had two sons. One of them became vice president, one of them became a sailor, and she never heard from or about either one of them again. And I think that that sort of was how the vice presidency was viewed in an earlier time, that it was not a significant role. It was, that the only constitutional duty is to preside over the Senate, and in the absence of the need to break a tie vote, even that is not necessarily always that important. So I think that in our time, certainly the vice president takes on projects and things, and beginning in the recent era, we've seen an increase or a growth in the relevance and importance of the vice presidency. But I don't think in that time, I don't think that Wallace and FDR were having regular meetings all the time. FDR had his circle of people. I don't think that was, I don't think it was unusual in 82 days that Truman was only around a couple of times.
Excellent. Well, thank you again, Dr. Graham, for joining us, and thank you all for joining us today. We, as a reminder, this program was the first in a 5-day series that's being offered by the Truman Library Institute. Registration links to the remaining 4 programs, including the one being hosted tomorrow afternoon by Clifton Truman Daniel, can be found on our website, trumanlibraryinstitute.org. In addition to these special webinars, we're commemorating the 75th anniversary of Truman's presidency over the coming weeks on all of our social channels. So be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for more stories about Harry Truman's early days as our 33rd president. Thanks again, Dr. Graham, for this wonderful presentation, and thank you all for joining us. We'll hope to see you tomorrow.
Thank you, Maureen.